There's a town in America where you can buy 40 acres for under $20,000, drill your own well, and live in a tent while you build. And nobody calls the county. No inspections, no angry letters, no one showing up asking how long this is supposed to be temporary. Which immediately sounds fake. Because we've all been taught that off-grid living only comes in two flavors. Option 1. A wealthy prepper with a $500,000 compound, backup generators, and a YouTube channel explaining why toothpaste is a scam. Option 2. A guy in a shack with no running water who insists this was always the plan. But here's the part nobody really talks about. Scattered across the United States are real towns, not myths, not loopholes, where off-grid living is legal, normal, and quietly tolerated. Places where building codes are minimal, or basically theoretical, where land prices sound like typos, and where your neighbors don't call the county because you installed solar panels and a composting toilet instead of granite countertops. This isn't a lawless wasteland. It's something more awkward for the system. It's a place where regulations just never fully showed up. Not because someone protested, not because freedom won a court case, but because nobody thought it was worth the effort. And that gap between what the rules say and what actually happens creates opportunity. Real opportunity, not influencer opportunity. Actual, boring, affordable land buying opportunity. So today, we're counting down 7 towns in the US where off-grid living isn't a fantasy, isn't a prepper hobby, and doesn't require a trust fund. Places where you can build what you can afford, live how you want, and where independence isn't suspicious. It's just normal. Before we start naming places, quick pause. If you're watching this thinking, wait, that's actually possible? Go ahead and subscribe. Not because this channel is inspirational, it's not. But because one day you might type cheap land into Google and immediately regret it. Because suddenly you're drowning in thumbnails of smiling people standing next to cabins that cost more than your entire existence. This channel is for the opposite of that. Actual places, actual counties, actual rules, or the lack of them. No vague ideas, no just manifest freedom, no selling you a dream that quietly requires a $300,000 mortgage. And yes, subscribing has side effects. Every time someone subscribes, somewhere a zoning office loses track of one more person. A clipboard goes missing. A permit form stays unfilled. A county employee thinks, honestly, not my problem. So subscribe if you like learning about places where nobody panics because your house looks unfinished, your toilet doesn't flush the right way, or your power comes from the sun instead of a bill. All right. Let's start with a town that looks like it shouldn't exist anymore, but somehow does. Terlingua looks like a place that forgot to die. It's a former mining town in far west Texas, right near Big Bend National Park, which is beautiful, dramatic, and extremely far from everything you care about. Officially, about 60 people live here. Unofficially, there are many more. They're just spread out far enough that nobody feels the need to count. And that's kind of the theme. Terlingua isn't lawless. It's just ignored. Brewster County is massive, over 6,000 square miles, with fewer people than a medium-sized neighborhood association, which creates a very specific vibe. Outside town limits, building codes are minimal to the point of being theoretical. Permits exist in the same way gym memberships exist in January. Technically real, but not aggressively enforced. People live in RVs, trailers, converted school buses, structures that started as temporary and slowly became don't ask, and nobody calls the county. Not because they're scared, because they don't care. Land out here is cheap enough to sound like a scam. $1,000 to $5,000 per acre, depending on access and how much you enjoy driving on roads that barely qualify as a suggestion. Solar works perfectly. The sun is relentless and takes its job very seriously. Water, on the other hand, is the problem. Wells can be expensive. Hauling water is normal. You don't waste it because suddenly water isn't a utility. It's a personality trait. Terlingua works because it filters people automatically. You're 3 hours from the nearest real town. Medical care is far. Summer heat regularly hits 110 degrees. This keeps out anyone who just liked the idea of freedom. People who stay here aren't pretending. They know exactly what they signed up for. One resident described Terlingua as freedom in its purest form. Nobody bothers you, and you can live exactly how you want. Then, they immediately added, it will absolutely break you if you're not prepared. Which is probably the most honest sales pitch you'll ever hear. Terlingua offers maximum freedom. It just charges for it in heat, distance, and silence. And that price keeps the wrong people away. Next up, a place where independence still exists, but you're not quite 3 hours from help. If Terlingua is freedom through isolation, Crestone is freedom with meetings. Not government meetings, just conversations that start with, "So what are you building?" and end with someone offering you a shovel. Crestone sits in southern Colorado at about 8,000 feet elevation, which immediately explains two things. 1, the views are ridiculous. 2, winter is not joking. This is an intentional community, which is a polite way of saying everyone here already agreed that normal life was optional. The town itself is small, but the off-grid population around it is much larger. Yurts, earthships, tiny homes, structures that don't fit neatly into real estate categories. And that's the point. Saguache County, where Crestone is located, has minimal building codes outside town limits. Enforcement exists, technically. But the culture is cooperative, not combative. You're not hiding from the system here. You're gently stepping around it while making eye contact. Land prices range from surprisingly affordable to, okay, that's still Colorado, depending on access, water rights, and how much altitude you're willing to emotionally process. Solar works incredibly well because the sun hits harder at elevation. Water is manageable, but you do have to understand rights, permits, and the sentence, yes, but it depends. The big difference between Crestone and a place like Terlingua is this. You're not alone here. There's an established off-grid community. People who've already made the mistakes. People who know which systems work and which ones sound great on forums and fail in February. That support makes off-grid living feel less like survival and more like a long-term plan. Of course, there are trade-offs. Winter is long, cold is serious, and the spiritual vibe is present. You will meet people who meditate. You will meet people who don't own shoes. Sometimes those are the same people. One resident summed it up perfectly. Crestone is ideal if you want independence without disappearing completely, which translates to, you can live off-grid, build something unconventional, and still borrow a ladder when you need one. Next up, back to the desert, where regulations loosen even more and the county barely remembers it exists. Tonopah exists because at some point, people needed a place between places. Las Vegas is too far one way. Reno is too far the other way, so Tonopah just stayed. It's a former mining town in the middle of Nevada, where the land is cheap, the rules are relaxed, and the desert has zero interest in your comfort. And that last part matters. Nye County, where Tonopah sits, is famous for being large, empty, and extremely unmotivated when it comes to micromanaging people. Building codes technically exist. So do unicorns. In practice, people live how they want. RVs, shipping containers, Self-built homes that started as temporary and quietly became permanent. Nobody's rushing over with a clipboard asking when the drywall is scheduled. Land prices are the kind that make real estate agents uncomfortable. $500 to $2,000 per acre for unimproved parcels, depending on access and how much driving you consider a personality trait. Solar works incredibly well because Nevada's sun does not believe in moderation. Clouds are rare. Shade is valuable. Water is the trade-off. Wells can be deep and expensive. Hauling water is common, and you learn very quickly that water conservation stops being theoretical when you're the one moving it. Tonopah works because Nevada, as a state, quietly decided long ago that adults can make their own decisions, and Nye County took that personally. The culture is libertarian in the most practical way possible. People leave you alone, not out of principle, out of habit. Of course, the desert collects its price. Summer heat regularly crosses 100 degrees. Winter nights get cold. Medical care is limited. Help is far, and not in a hurry. One off-grid resident put it perfectly. You can do basically whatever you want out here. Just don't expect anyone to save you from it. Tonopah offers legendary freedom. It just expects you to be competent. Next up, a place where off-grid living meets hot springs, artists, and a town that decided being weird was a feature, not a bug. Truth or consequences already sounds like a dare, which is appropriate because living here kind of is one. This is a small town in southern New Mexico that rebranded itself after a radio show in the 1950s and then just leaned into the chaos. Hot springs, artists, retirees, off-grid people who didn't want total isolation, just less supervision. Sierra County, where TRC is located, has relatively relaxed building codes outside city limits. Enforcement exists, but it's focused on actual problems, not vibes. Which is why off-grid living works here. Land around town is affordable, cheap enough to be real, not, this has to be a scam cheap. Solar works extremely well because New Mexico treats sunlight like a public service. Water is available. But here's where you have to pay attention. Wells are legal. Permits exist. Water rights matter. This is not the place where you buy land first and Google water laws later, unless you enjoy emotional damage. The upside is the balance. You can live off-grid on rural land and still drive into town for supplies, groceries, and hot springs when your bones start making noises. There's a real community here, not a commune, not a cult, just a loose network of people who mind their business and don't freak out if your house looks unconventional. TRC works because it doesn't force you to choose between freedom and civilization. You can be independent without being invisible. The downside? Summer heat gets serious. The town itself is economically quiet. Services exist, but nobody's rushing. One resident described it as off-grid living with a safety net, which translates to, you're still responsible for yourself, but you're not 3 hours from help if things go sideways. Truth or consequences is where off-grid stops feeling extreme and starts feeling sustainable. Next up, a place so small and remote that off-grid living isn't a lifestyle choice. It's just what happens when nobody's around. Pie Town exists because someone once sold pie here. That's it. That's the origin story. No gold rush, no railroad, just pie. And then everyone left. Today, about 60 people live here, scattered across a landscape so empty it feels like the county forgot to finish loading, which, conveniently, it kind of did. Pie Town sits in Catron County, one of the least populated counties in the entire United States. Huge territory, almost no people, and a county government with bigger problems than asking what you're building. This is the kind of place where off-grid living isn't a statement. It's the default. Land is cheap, really cheap. The kind of cheap that makes you double-check the listing, and then Google Why is nobody buying this? Building codes technically exist. Enforcement capacity does not. People live in RVs, cabins, structures that started as temporary 5 years ago, and nobody followed up. Solar works well, though winter clouds do show up occasionally, just to remind you that this is still real life. Water comes from wells or hauling. You plan carefully, because nothing here is convenient by accident. The climate is cooler than the low desert. Higher elevation, pine forests nearby, actual seasons, which sounds nice until winter shows up and asks if you're serious about this. Snow happens, cold is real, medical care is far, very far. The nearest real hospital is over an hour away on a good day, and nobody pretends that's fine. And that's why Pie Town works. It filters people aggressively. If you're here, it's because you already accepted the trade-off. One resident put it bluntly, "Nobody bothers you here, but if something goes wrong, it's your problem." Pie Town offers extreme autonomy. No neighbors, no oversight, no safety net, just land, silence, and the understanding that freedom doesn't come with customer support. Next up, we cross back into Texas, where everything is bigger, hotter, and just as uninterested in supervision. Presidio County is Texas with the volume turned all the way down. This is far west Texas, so far west that Texas starts to feel theoretical. Big sky, empty land, distances that quietly warn you not to be dramatic. Most people know this area because of Marfa, art, mystery lights, people staring into the desert and pretending it's an experience. But most of Presidio County is none of that. It's empty, which is exactly why off-grid living works here. Outside incorporated areas, building codes are minimal. Not creative interpretation minimal, just genuinely not a priority. Land can still be found for prices that feel very un-Texas. Remote parcels go cheap, especially if you're comfortable with dirt roads that aggressively test your suspension and your commitment. Solar works beautifully. The sun is constant, relentless, and clearly not on anyone's payroll. Water is the challenge. Wells can be expensive. Hauling water is normal, and you learn very quickly that planning matters more than optimism. The local culture is pure Texas property rights energy. People don't ask questions. They don't offer opinions. They don't care what you're building unless it's on fire. You can live in an RV, build slowly, experiment with alternative structures, and nobody shows up asking for a timeline. Of course, there are trade-offs. Summer heat is brutal. 110 degrees isn't a headline. It's Tuesday. Medical care is limited. And yes, being close to the border means Border Patrol checkpoints, which some people find annoying and others file under part of the deal. One off-grid resident summed it up perfectly. You get space, freedom, and silence. You just don't get comfort or convenience. Presidio County is for people who want Texas independence without neighbors, without cities, and without anyone checking how permanent temporary has become. Next, the final place. The one that actually balances freedom, affordability, and access without pretending you don't need civilization at all. Elko County is where off-grid stops being an experiment and starts looking like a long-term decision. This is northeastern Nevada, huge, dry, and quietly functional. There is a town, there is a hospital, there are supplies, and then there is everything else. Vast stretches of land where nobody's interested in what you're building, how long it's taking, or whether it fits someone's 5-year vision statement. Outside city limits, regulations are minimal, not non-existent. Let's be adults. But light enough that people can actually live. Land is affordable by Nevada standards. $1,000 to $4,000 per acre isn't unusual if you're okay with distance and dirt roads that expect respect. Solar works beautifully. The climate is high desert. Lots of sun, 4 seasons, real winters, but nothing theatrical. Water is manageable. Wells are legal. Costs are reasonable compared to other desert counties. You don't feel like you're gambling your entire future on whether you hit water. And that's the difference. Elko doesn't ask you to choose between freedom and survival. You can live off-grid and be 30 minutes from groceries. You can build independently and still reach a hospital without writing a will first. There's an established off-grid community here. People who already figured things out. People who share information instead of guarding it like a secret. The culture is practical. No speeches about freedom. No romantic nonsense. Just adults who want land, space, and fewer rules. The downsides are real. It's remote. Jobs are limited. Mining exists whether you like it or not. But Elko County works because it understands something most places don't. Pure isolation sounds great, until you need help. Full regulation feels safe, until you can't afford to exist. Elko sits in the uncomfortable middle. Enough freedom to live your own life. Enough access to not disappear completely. And for most people, that balance isn't a compromise. It's the goal. By now, one thing should be obvious. These towns aren't cheap because nobody wants them. They're cheap because they demand something most people aren't willing to give. Distance, responsibility, and the uncomfortable realization that freedom doesn't come with customer service. Off-grid living isn't about escaping society. It's about stepping far enough away that your life stops being micromanaged by systems that charge you monthly for permission. In most places, income is survival. Not because you want luxury, but because rent, utilities, insurance, and fees stack up until working becomes mandatory, not optional. In the towns you just saw, that equation breaks. When land is affordable, when power comes from the sun, when water is planned instead of billed, money stops being the main character. People still work. They still plan. They still solve problems. They just don't panic every time a paycheck is late. And that's why these places aren't advertised. They don't scale. They don't sell well. They don't benefit from attention. The moment too many people show up, rules arrive, prices follow, and the window quietly closes. These towns exist in the gap, between regulation and neglect, between convenience and control. They're not easy. They're not for everyone. And they're definitely not forgiving. But they prove something uncomfortable. That independence isn't dead. It's just geographically inconvenient. So no, this isn't a guide telling you to move tomorrow. It's a map showing that alternatives still exist. And once you know that, paying thousands a month to exist under fluorescent lights starts to feel less like adulthood and more like a very expensive habit. If you made it this far, you already know why these places matter. Not because they're perfect, but because they remind you that life doesn't have to be optimized, approved, and invoiced to work. Sometimes freedom isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a piece of land, a system you understand, and nobody asking what you're doing. See you in the next one.